Hey friends, welcome or welcome back. My name is Shannon, and today we are going to talk about some Tudor history nonfiction that I have in my collection that I'm hoping to read in the next year or so. Now, I could spend this whole channel talking about either Jane Austen or the Tudors. Those are two of my favorite topics to read and discuss. And I've been pretty restrained on this channel. I've only done, at the time of filming, maybe 3 videos on Jane Austen, because I know she's not everyone's cup of tea. And I haven't done any videos on the Tudors until now. And I'm actually really excited to talk about one of, my other favorite subject. I was inspired to do this video because in a couple of weeks, I am heading to see one of my favorite musicals, Six, which is a fun poppy musical about the six wives of Henry VIII. This will be my third time seeing it, and I just enjoy it so much. It's just such a fun musical. So I figured let's go over some unread Tudor books that I have in my collection, and this is all nonfiction. I generally don't read Tudor historical fiction, and that's because I'm always afraid I'm going to conflate the history. I just don't trust myself to read the fiction and the nonfiction and not conflate the two. So that's just my own personal preference. If you love reading historical fiction about the Tudors, please do so. I'm sure it's great, and I'm sure you can actually learn a lot from it. And this video is just going to be about books that I haven't read yet. I do have a separate video being planned for recommendations of books that I have already read. All right, so let's get started. The first book I have is The Wives of Henry VIII by Antonia Fraser. I have a few books by Antonia Fraser. She is a well-known British historical biographer. And if you know anything about Tudor history, it's mainly famous mostly because Henry VIII and, his chaotic reign and the fact that he had 6 wives. And there's, a little childhood rhyme that a lot of British kids learn about Henry VIII to remember the wives, and it's divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So this will go over the 6 wives, his first wife being Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess and the mother of Mary the First. Henry VIII divorced her. It was a absolute chaotic divorce, and it was because of this divorce that Henry VIII broke from the Church of Rome and just basically launched England into the Protestant religion. I don't think it was his intention. Henry VIII was Catholic and stayed Catholic until his death, but because of that, because he didn't want to be told what to do by Rome, because he broke with Rome and started his own church, that ushered in the Protestant religion, which had already been gaining momentum at that time. So, divorced his wife, broke with the church to marry Anne Boleyn, one of his most famous queens, because of this divorce. I mean, what was so great about Anne Boleyn that he literally started a new church? What was so great? So she was a commoner. She was the mother of Elizabeth I, and she was beheaded. And a couple of days after her beheading, he married his third wife, Jane Seymour, also a commoner, mother of Edward VI. She died from complications of childbirth. And Jane Seymour is the wife that he is buried with. I can't remember exactly where they are buried. I want to say in Windsor, but I could be making that up. I just can't remember. So after he got over the death of his third wife, he decided, all right, maybe I'll make a dynastic marriage this time and marry a foreign princess. And he married Anne of Cleves, who was a German princess. He divorced Anne of Cleves. He did not like her. He did not like the way that she looked. And, they didn't even speak the same language. And my opinion is that Anne of Cleves was probably the smartest wife. She agreed to the divorce, and she ended up having a really spectacular life. She stayed in England. She had a place in court as the highest ranking female next to his daughters. She was called the king's beloved sister, and she was given a generous settlement. She had a very, very restricted life in Germany, but in England, she lived her best life. So she probably was the smartest. Next, after Anne of Cleves, was Catherine Howard, who was a commoner, and she was 17 years old when she married Henry. And it's more than likely that she did commit adultery. And she was probably not the smartest of his wives. I mean, she was just very, very young. And by this time, Henry was a lot older and he was a lot angrier and he was, pretty much a tyrant by this time. And she ended up being beheaded along with several other people who were executed with her, including the two men that it was suspected that she had relationships with and her lady in waiting for supposedly helping her. After that, he married again, this time Catherine Parr, also a commoner, and she is the one that survived him. Henry was her third husband, and after Henry passed away, she went on to marry Thomas Seymour, who was a man that she had wanted to marry before she met Henry, but she felt duty bound to accept the king's proposal, so she told Thomas, hey, sorry, I can't marry you. Now, the thing about Thomas is he may or may not have tried some inappropriate things with Elizabeth I, who was living with Catherine after her father died. Basically, Catherine Parr took guardianship of Elizabeth, and they were living in the same house. And so Thomas may or may not have tried some things with Elizabeth. And so Elizabeth was removed from the house, and then Catherine died in childbirth. So this is the story of the Six Wives. Next, we have Mary Boleyn, The Mistress of Kings by Alison Weir. Alison Weir is one of my favorite British historical authors. I have many books by her. And Mary was the sister of Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife. Remember, we just talked about her. And it was rumored that she had been Henry's mistress before he met Anne. So Mary and Anne were also first cousins to Catherine Howard, who was Henry's fifth wife. So keeping it all in the family. In addition, it was also rumored that she was the mistress of Francis I of France before she met Henry. So she spent a lot of time in France. Both Mary and Anne, I don't know if they entirely grew up in France, but they spent a lot of time in France before coming back to England. And the French court was, very licentious and sensual, and supposedly the girls learned things that they wouldn't have learned at the English court. Not much is known about her life, and she ended up marrying someone without royal permission and then basically was banished and disowned by Henry and Anne and likely died in poverty. Next, we have Crown of Blood, The Deadly Inheritance of Lady Jane Grey. Poor Lady Jane. She was the 9 Days Queen. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII from his daughter Mary. So Mary Tudor was a sister to Henry VIII. And she was in the direct line of succession after Henry VIII's children, according to how Henry VIII set up the succession. Henry's son, Edward VI, did not want the throne to go to Catholic Mary or to bastard Elizabeth. And supposedly, Edward VI's decision to have the crown go to Lady Jane Grey was supported by the Privy Council. So when Edward died, Jane was proclaimed queen on July 10th, 1553. And then something happened, and Mary I, who was Edward's elder sister, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, managed to get the support of the Privy Council, who flipped sides and then proclaimed Mary queen on July 19th. So Lady Jane Grey was queen for only 9 days. And Mary stormed into the capital, put Lady Jane Grey and a whole bunch of other people in the Tower of London, and then Jane was executed 4 months later. And at the time of execution, she was only about 16 or 17 years old. Next, we have 2 books pretty much focusing on Anne Boleyn. The first one being Hunting the Falcon by John Guy and Julia Fox, Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, and the Marriage That Shook Europe. And then the second is Thorns, Lust, and Glory, The Betrayal of Anne Boleyn by Estell Paranque. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And so these are the two books about Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn. And Hunting the Falcon, I think, focuses on the beginning of the marriage, his obsessive desire for a son and for Anne that, like I said before, literally tore apart the country and created a new church. He was just obsessed with both getting a son and obsessed with getting Anne Boleyn. And that's how Protestantism ended up in England. I don't think it was Henry's intention, but that's what happened. And I believe Thorns, Lust, and Glory talks about pretty much the end of their marriage. What happened to get her executed. It will also talk about Anne's part in the story as well, how she was a shrewd politician in her own right, which basically contributed to her downfall. And Thorns, Lust, and Glory is going to talk about that downfall. Next, we have The Waiting Game, the untold story of the women who served the Tudor queens by Nicola Clark. Now, this actually hasn't been published in the US yet. I believe it's coming out in January. So I ordered this from the UK, and this explores the lives of the ladies in waiting of the Tudor court, how they were recruited, what they wore, where and with whom they slept. Talks about their loyalties. These ladies in waiting were instrumental in the rise and fall of their queens. And one lady in waiting in particular was instrumental in bringing down two Tudor queens, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. They had the same lady in waiting. And, because of her big mouth, two queens ended up getting executed. They probably would have been executed anyway, but she just helped usher it along a little bit quicker. Next, we have The Thistle and the Rose, The Extraordinary Life of Margaret Tudor by Linda Porter. Now, everybody talks about Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, but what about Margaret? Margaret Tudor was Henry VIII's older sister. He had two sisters, Margaret and Mary, but Margaret was married to James IV of Scotland at 13 years old. Now, it's very unlikely that the marriage was consummated when she was 13. Lots of princesses were contracted in marriage to foreign kings, etc., when they were about 13 years old, but they generally were not consummated until, the princess was a little bit older. So through that marriage, she was the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots. So through her first marriage to James IV, and then through her second marriage, she was also the grandmother of Lord Darnley. Lord Darnley married the Queen of Scots and then was famously murdered. And then their son became James VI of Scotland. And James VI of Scotland ended up becoming James I of England. And so this book is going to go over Margaret's life, and she had a very, very interesting life. Her marriage to James VI, she was regent for a little while. She ended up having to escape Scotland because they were unhappy with her second or third marriage. I can't remember. She had several marriages. She ended up going back to England and being sheltered by her brother, Henry VIII, and then she ended up back in Scotland. So she had a very interesting life, and her descendants were also fascinating. And this is actually a good segue into the next book, which is After Elizabeth, The Rise of James of Scotland and the Struggle for the Throne of England by Leanda de Lisle. Now, this is actually kind of a bonus because James VI of Scotland, also James I of England, is not a Tudor. He is a Stuart. But I felt like I wanted to add this in because he is descendant from Tudors. Elizabeth I had no children, and she had no heir. And the closest male relative was James VI of Scotland, who was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the descendant of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. However, Henry VIII's Act of Succession before he died had specifically excluded Margaret's line from the succession. And it was supposed to go to his other sister, Mary. And that's how Lady Jane Grey became queen, because by following the Act of Succession, we skip over Margaret's line and you went to Mary's line. Because Margaret was married to a foreign king, he didn't want that king taking over England. So he specifically excluded Margaret's line. But Elizabeth decided to go with him and gave the throne to him. So, and this book is going to explain how, in the end of the Tudors gave rise to the Stuarts, crowning James VI of Scotland as James I of England. So that's it. 8 books about the Tudor dynasty that I am looking forward to reading. And have you read any of these? Are you interested in the Tudors? Do you find that they get way too much coverage and way too much credit? Let me know what you think. I personally enjoy the Tudors. They certainly were an interesting period in British history. Maybe not the greatest, but it certainly was interesting. So let me know what you think. Have you read any of these? Are there any that you think I should pick up? I do have a video coming out about Tudor books that I have read, so that'll be coming out soon. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great day. Bye.